Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So I wanted to get your insights as to what the environment in Minnesota is like, given that we have this case that has become the Floyd case has become a national attention point, and there's so many layers of the stories that have surrounded the whole reality that at times it feels it took on a life of its own in multiple directions. And you see different tendencies in how we're understanding what happened. And I wanted to kind of get a Minnesotan feel, not not necessarily personal, because I know that is, if you wanted to share that, that's fine. But just to get a general Minnesotan feel of how this whole event was understood, especially surrounding the store, because recently there's been some posts with regard to the store, and the post kind of was shaping the way that we should understand the reality. And I know that if we were to dissect the post, it would pretty much bring us into a direct conflict between the African American and Arab American, or Arab immigrant and Arab American communities. And I think that
Yep.
it will bring us right back into a problem with the indigenous and immigrant communities as to why everything is wrong and why nothing seems to be right type of atmosphere concept.
Yeah, I can only, talk from the perspective of a white Muslim male, but I did, spend time living, growing up on Chicago Avenue, about a mile and a half, 20 blocks south of, Chicago and 38th. And I used to work at this Somali Mall Supa Carmel, in the Twin Cities. And so every day I used to drive up and down Chicago Avenue, going past Cut Foods and the SA there, not now Speedway or whatever gas station, Baha'i Temple, all that. And I used to shop at Cut Foods, get halal meat from there. And, it's a masjid underneath in the basement. I've prayed Jum'ah there before. I met like the owners of Mahmoud and his family, back 2010, 2011. And, I lived there on and off because my grandmother, who's a matriarch of my family, lives down there. And, shortly after George Floyd's murder, I was there protesting quite a lot and spending a lot of time down there at the memorial. And one of the things that I noticed that was quite bothersome to me was that all these people from all over the country flocked into the scene, and the local activists were kind of pushed to the side. And so you had, activists that were from all different states who are involved with the Black Lives Matter movement, who came to kind of, I guess, rally people together and get people charged up to, make some change. But the problem is when the media came from different states as well, these were figures that they already knew, that they interacted with before in separate incidents. And so they just ran to them to interview them about things. And they didn't talk to the local activists at all. The local activists were largely ignored. And so there was no local perspective really ever given. Most of the national news coverage, everything that I seen from the national news was not really accurate about the situation on the ground.
It's funny that you say that, because I've been out to protests, and those protests have been organized on some occasions by Black Lives Matters. And so there's been an interesting development that's very similar and overlaps with what you have said in recent times, that development has shown that there is a definite gap between national figureheads and people that are on the ground locally, or even victims and their families. And so, for instance, like in Cleveland, Ohio, with Tamir Rice, his family, Samaria Rice, she's been really strong and vocal as to that disconnect between national activists that have a tendency of having a media platform. And that's not to take away necessarily from national activists and what they do.
Right.
But in this case, those who are not directly impacted and affected by these murders that have been taking place, how they have in many ways been given the leadership, not only over platforms, but also over funding, and also over the narrative, also
Mhm.
over the narrative. And that's kind of, I think that what you're bringing up is something that is, I think, on the activist level, is something that is extremely important to understand, is how do we understand these narratives? Because if these narratives of what took place, if they, as Muslims, there's no claim to being perfect, but there's a claim to at least having some sort of ethical framework to refer to. It's not a
Mhm.
claim that we're perfect or anything like that. But like in this case, the narrative over what took place and how it took place and who's responsible outside of the police, that's a different dimension. These narratives, if they're spinned out in a certain way, and we keep seeing these narratives that are spinned out in a certain way, sometimes they're factual and sometimes they're not. When you join them to other narratives, when you join all these disparate narratives, we as a country are put in a situation where we're in a volatile situation. So, like for instance, the George Floyd case went international. The outcry was international. It wasn't just local, zonal, regional. It wasn't half of the country. It was international, and it wasn't just one particular group. And it was a lot of people jumped on board, whether religious, not religious, different classes, different
Yep.
ethnic groups. So, in a case like this, the getting the facts right, or at least enough of the facts, so that we have a truthful representation of the event or the story, or the surrounding realities, is extremely important, because again, we're in a volatile situation in this country, very volatile. Even I was reading a report that was saying that if there's no justice for George Floyd, and this is related to the fact that there's a trial going on, if there's no justice for George Floyd, that the country is going to riot.
Oh, for sure. I mean, people got their Molotov cocktails ready.
And that's
That's the
that's the
reality.
that's the issue that we're saying, because here, that's the issue that we're trying to bring up right now. This is a running conversation between people, between activists, between you and I, even on this point. How do we understand the Muslim role in this? Because the Muslim role, when we start talking about convenience stores, we know that this is a heated point. It's not a personal, private
Right.
conversation anymore. This is a conversation with regard to the role of Muslims in convenience stores in the inner city, and in specific poor people, and
Mhm.
how the relationship of these stores, is with poor people. Even
Yep.
national media coverage has picked up on the story, kind of done some investigative journalist piece. And so you can find, like, whether on NPR, or you can find like some news articles that actually are detailing the sentiment of people that live in these communities where these stores exist. And there's even YouTube documentation, or documentation of people documenting their frustration, putting on video their confrontation with store owners. And this is not a new phenomenon. This goes all the way back to the 90s.
Yeah, I was gonna say even in the 90s, I seen films of, Black Muslims confronting their Arab, store owners. So this ain't nowhere, this ain't nothing new at all.
Yeah, this is not new at all. And then there's the other side of that is not just the issue of the confrontation, it's also the issue that this has become, this has become a center or even a matrix where murder takes place.
For sure, yeah.
And it takes place on multiple levels.
We know what happened in South Central LA.
Yeah, and so you're seeing more and more. These stores also are points where there's robberies because of the high alcohol, the high, basically talking about high cash flow. They become points for robberies. I myself had a person in my congregation that was killed in Ohio. May Allah have mercy on him. He was part of that, an establishment that had a drive-through, store where you can come in and get your alcohol, just and never leave your car and just pull out. And so that became a point where there was robberies, and in one of them, someone came to rob the place, and he was shot, and he shot back, and he ended up being one of the ones that was dead. And so this is something that we've talked about in the Muslim community quite a bit, about these types of relationships which are exploitative, and they're layered. We never talk about the middleman minority concept, how within the colonial reality, these people are pushed out, and where they end up is in these situations that are technically, exploitative situations, even though they're businesses. But the way that they relate to the community is one of exploitation in terms of price, quality of food, relationship. It's not a necessarily healthy environment. So I wanted to just go back, tone down a little bit on my side, and I wanted to go back to just say that's the context of where the Muslims are in the bigger picture. If we don't get these narratives correct, we ourselves, even NPR in with their interview with the head of Iman, brought up this issue of the role of Muslims in these stores. And even Dr. Rami, he came out and he acknowledged, as a Palestinian American, he acknowledged that there was a problem in the relationship. And even they were trying
Iman in Chicago, right?
Yeah, in Chicago. And they were trying to fix it, or trying to address it. Even some of us can critique and say they don't go all the way or whatever it may be, but they were attempting to, ameliorate the conditions. Where do you see in specific this store? Is this store engaged in that type of exploitative relationship? And I've been trying to really frame this in such a way so that it doesn't, I should say, where does the community see it? I don't want to put that on you as an individual, but where does the community see it? Or at least from what you heard. And then what do you think this means for Muslims? All of this, because the Muslims are front and center with this stuff at the moment.
Yeah, so I just want to say, my goal isn't to override or erase anyone's voices. I can only convey the things that I've been personally told. So, take it for what it is. But my first experience with cup foods, I remember I would see it driving to work, and I would see that it was looked like a halal store, but I wasn't quite sure. It was a little ambiguous, right? And I asked someone about it at the Somali mall that I worked at, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's a halal store. They're owned by Arabs." And I'd always see this SUV next to it that had the Shahada written on it. Okay. So that I found out later was the owner's vehicle. So I stopped there one day after work and got some halal meat and talked with them. I remember seeing a guy with like a Afghani pakul, and big beard sitting in there at a lunch table. The guy that behind the counter, the cashier, he was an Oromo, Ethiopian Muslim. And it just seemed like a real kind of, urban, like Muslim cool environment, right? And you hear rumors like, oh, don't go to Chicago and 38th. That's where the Black people are. That's the ghetto of Chicago Avenue, this little tiny pocket. But really, most of the residents there, around there are white. So, I mean, it's kind of like this racist like stereotype that's been implanted in a lot of people in Minneapolis, this idea. But my interactions with the store, it just seemed like kind of a halal store, corner store. It didn't seem exploitative to me at all back then. And with the George Floyd protest, talking to people, I heard a lot of rhetoric, more so from the people out of state, that, oh, we should have burned this place down. The only reason we didn't burn this place down is because there's apartments above, families and kids. But when you talk to the locals, most of the locals that I talked to said, these people have always been good to the community. They said, they're married to Black women. They've always cared about, social justice and racial issues, always tried to be anti-racist. They were there with, Jamar Clark and Philando Castile and all these things, like there for the community always. And they've lived, I guess you might say, like Black-centered lives in a sense. And they've always been just try to be good to the community. And I always thought about that stereotypical exploitative relationship you see with Arab corner stores in neighborhoods that are Black, or whatever, in that regard, where they're dealing with lots of Black customers. And I'll tell you what, in Minneapolis, I've seen a lot of those exploitative type of corner stores. I've seen them in Northeast Minneapolis and various different places. I ain't gonna name names. And we know there was a big controversy with Holy Land in North Minneapolis as well. That's an Arab, restaurant / halal store, and place in the community that they've been quite racist to a lot of Black customers, Somalis and African American. I've seen it with my own eyes. The bias that they had. So generally, Cup Foods was looked at as the more favorable place out of all the other places in the Twin Cities. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect or whatever, but that was a general impression I've gotten from people who live around that area. So I hope that's
I
kind
think,
of
yeah, and I think that there
nutshell.
was a confusion at some point between Cup Foods and Holy Land because of the way that the narrative was being weaved, so to speak. The store owners, because wasn't Holy Land implicated in some sort of, like, wasn't a family member identified online as spewing out some racist rhetoric or something like that?
I believe it was the owner's daughter who had some like old racist posts on like Instagram or Twitter or something of that nature. And I've seen them and they were pretty bad. And I can understand why people reacted the way they reacted. And the argument was like, well, if this is how your kid is, I can only imagine how you are. And then when that happened, a lot of ex-employees who were Black came out and said, yeah, they treated us foul. A lot of customers came out and said, yeah, we were treated in a racist manner at your store. You need to do something about this. So it was more than just certain family members, social media stuff. I think the son also had, was caught on camera saying the N-word at a nightclub and things like that. So, I mean, but that's what started people coming out to tell their stories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's why I was saying, I think that began in some cases overshadowed or even became the impression of Cup Foods, that it was that type of situation.
Well, definitely it left, I guess, to say the least, it's a bad taste in the Black Muslim community for sure. And so they kind of had this, I guess you might say, outcry against Holy Land. And maybe, some of those, that pain and that hurt was still fresh, and it could have been transferred over to Cup Foods. I mean, the thing is, Cup Foods is kind of like a small local family type of store. And this part of Southside Minneapolis. Southside Minneapolis generally is kind of known as the better part of Minneapolis, and Northside is known to be the area with more poverty. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite of Chicago in that sense. So I mean, this store, it's not a place like where people outside of that neighborhood outside of that area would really go to shop at. You know what I mean? And so it was like a lot of people in Minneapolis probably never even knew about this store before George Floyd, frankly. You know, the Muslim community who lived on the South Side knew about it because it was a halal store and a place to pray, you know? And I think because this act of murder and police brutality and blatant racism happened in front of a masjid, in front of a halal store, that the Muslim community was particularly activated and paying attention. And the Muslim community in Minnesota is overwhelmingly Black. I would say over 90% Somali, not to mention African-American community, right? So, I mean, from the very beginning, Muslims were involved in a major contingency, you might say, or battalion within the protests. And we looked at it as literally like a jihad. We're fighting against the oppressors. You know, you got Hufad of Quran throwing tear gas canisters back at the police at the 5th precinct. You know, you got shuyukh who are encouraging people to go out and protest. I ain't gonna name names or people gonna charge them with inciting a riot, but that's the reality, okay? You know, this very much was looked at as a duty that Muslims had to fulfill here in Minnesota. You know, we ain't gonna let this slide. This is our ethical duty. This is our duty to God, you know, to make sure something like this never happens again.
But don't you think that that could be misunderstood as it woven back into the same type of, you know, narrative about the Muslims and so on and so forth as being the militant terrorists, that type of concept?
I mean, nobody was talking about outright terrorism or anything like that. We're talking about protesting, and we mean it peacefully, but we look at it as a struggle, right? This ain't we're talking about losing an eye because you got shot in the eye by a rubber bullet. Like, this is some serious business. Talking about getting lung damage from tear gas. Like, you know, we looked at it as this is like a real struggle. This ain't no, you know, standing on the sidewalk free speech zone. You know what I mean? It was traumatizing. I think a lot of us we got PTSD from it, frankly. You know, I had a car white supremacist almost run me over and kill me. You know, it was like very scary, frightening stuff. You know, a lot of the protesters were armed with guns, literally. You know, and they were, you know, some of them, I remember a Jamaican man, he was telling me, you know, if the police shoot at me, I'm going to shoot back. That was the climate. You know,
And that's why I said if the narrative is not clear and sound, it could be a narrative which exacerbates and makes the situation more acute. It can make it more tense and problematic.
Yeah.
Especially right now even on relationships between the Muslims themselves and the Muslims and the society in general, right? Especially when we start talking about the Black community, you know, and that's why as this trial continues forward, I think that, because I know I was told before, I was in a meeting on this of how this should be addressed with some Muslim leadership. And people were, you know, there was a particular voice that came out and said, you know, well, we're not going to criticize the Muslims. You know, there was that mindset of immediately, you know, we're not going to address this directly. And I've always felt that was problematic. And of course, that voice actually came from an immigrant brother. That's just not where the sentiment is at with the indigenous Muslims. The indigenous Muslims are fed up with the exploitative relationships that exist between people, regardless of who they are.
Right.
And in specific, this has been a point of massive, controversial, tense, you know, of relationships between the Muslims themselves, like this situation. And that's why, like, for instance, what you're saying gives a whole different spin that gives us a different way to identify who the people were in that relationship, versus what we're used to hearing or what we're used to seeing or what other people have, interpreted to be the case. That's why this is one of the reasons why I think that, uh, doing this reflection is important for people to understand the nuances here and so on and so forth. And there's also the question too of, where do we stand in society? I mean, you brought up the whole issue, about justice. Where do we stand in society? Like, what is the role of the Muslim activist? Like, who is the Muslim activist in today's time? Is the Muslim activist the one that's just, this is a very, I think this is another trajectory in the reflection. But who is the Muslim activist in today's time? Is the Muslim activist just the one that goes to protest and gets the media coverage, and just kind of associates the name with whatever it is that's hot at the moment within activist protest circles? Or is the Muslim activist the one that is, or, brother or sister, male or female, the one that is looking to better the society? You see what I'm saying? Looking to actually better the society and looking for where that balance is between the greater good, and a particular group interest or the individual in the group. Like, where do you see the Muslim activists, since you have taken on that type of role as a scholar activist?
I mean, ultimately, our activism has to be informed by Islamic ethics, right? It has to be informed by not only Sharia, but I think, ihsan. We have to look at everything through that lens and from an indigenous Islamic epistemology. The way I think a lot of us looked at this in the Twin Cities is, whoever saves a soul has saved all of humanity. That was literally graffitied and painted on the side of one of the masjids after the George Floyd incident. Okay. Islamic Dawah Center in St. Paul, Minnesota. So, I mean, this was something I think we all took very seriously, but then again, we all wanted it to be grounded in the Islamic tradition. We wanted to show up as believing, practicing Muslims and say, hey, this type of behavior from the police is unacceptable. Okay. And I think a lot of us, especially those on the South Side, I don't think we put a huge amount of blame on the owners of Cup Foods, because I think a lot of people in the local area themselves knew that this was a place the FBI surveilled a lot before George Floyd. Now with the trial, we know the government had cameras all around the store, and that was known as like a rumor on the street, before George Floyd was killed. That was something everyone kind of knew or talked about. All right. And now with the trial, we see it for a fact. We saw it yesterday in the trial, that they had, I think, at least 3 cameras like on different areas of Cup Foods, because right behind Cup Foods in the alleyway is where a local criminal organization operates. Okay. And I'm not going to say a whole lot more than that, but it was suspected that the counterfeit bills had something to do with them. And the counterfeit bills were being found, in the local area and different businesses, found inside the machine of the laundromat down the street, being found at the dollar store. Even Wells Fargo down the street, Wells Fargo Bank was missing them. Okay. I even believe that someone told me that the Health Partners Clinic is called down there even got one of these counterfeit bills once. So, I mean, this was kind of like an ongoing issue there. And the FBI, I guess they thought, this is kind of the rumor on the street, the FBI was thinking most of them were coming through Cup Foods. And so they had put significant pressure. And again, this is all oral kind of history. They put significant pressure on the owners of Cup Foods in regards to this, saying, if you do not put more measures in place to catch counterfeit bills, we will prosecute you into the ground and you'll have to close your business.